In this instructional video, we'll go over the genitive absolute. And the genitive absolute refers to a particular grammatical construction where a given participle is in the genitive case, it can be singular, plural, and the subject of the participle is also in the genitive case. So a noun and pronoun. So the subject of this participle is in the genitive case. So far, you've had translations where the subject of the main verb, is also the subject of the participle. They're one and the same. So the person who's doing the action of the main verb of the sentence is also doing the action of the participle. But what if you want the two different subjects? The subject doing the action of the participle is not the same as the subject doing the action of the main verb. How do we show a different subject for the participle? And that's where the genitive absolute comes. So if the main verb, something in the indicative mood, or it could be in a non-indicative mood, but not as a participle. If something is the subject for the main verb, you learn that the subject is always in the nominative case, and then it's going to match in person, number, and gender with the main verb of the sentence. Well, for participle construction, the subject of the participle is not in the nominative case, but in the genitive case, and that's why it's called the genitive absolute. I think the best way is to go over some examples. So in Matthew 9:33, in the Greek text, you have kai ekblethentos tu daimoniou elelesin ha kophos. Kophos being a mute person, or since it's a masculine pronoun, a mute man. Notice that ekblethentos, that is an aorist passive participle from ekbalo, and it's passive, and it's in the genitive singular case, and then here we have a genitive singular neuter noun. It's a passive form. So something is being cast out, and what's being cast out is the ta daimonion. So the way I would translate this, remember this is an aorist construction, so therefore you would use the conjunction after. And after the demon had been cast out, the mute man elelesin, or spoke. Here, the subject, demon, is doing the action of the participle, had been cast out, or is receiving the action of the participle, since it's a passive form. And the mute man, a different subject, is doing the speaking. And so the genitive absolute is a way for the author to have a different subject for the participle. So let's look at another example, Matthew 17:9. Katabainaton aton. Notice that here I gave a genitive plural example, and this is a general plural subject. Aton is the genitive subject for this participle in the genitive. Again, this is an example of the genitive absolute. And then this is a present participle. The main verb of the sentence is past time. He commanded, but in this case it's Jesus. Jesus commanded. So I would translate this as while, because it's a present participle, while they were descending or coming down ek to orus, from the mountain, Jesus, ha Jesus, the subject, Jesus commanded them. The important thing here is that the ones who's doing descending is not Jesus. Jesus is probably already at the location, and the author wants to say that the disciples were coming down from the mountain. And when the disciples were coming down from the mountain, then Jesus commanded them. And so, again, the genitive absolute is a construction where the participle is in the genitive, and if you want the subject of the participle to be different from the main word of the sentence, put the subject in the genitive case, match it in case, number, and gender, and you will have what we call the genitive absolute construction. For this last part, this is optional. Because Mounts goes over this in the advanced section of your book, I'll go over it. But I am not going to test you on any part of what follows. There are more ways to translate the adverbial participle. So this is kind of a heads up. This is kind of a preview. You're gonna be mostly doing this in third semester Greek. So the third Greek class in exegesis. You'll be going over the different uses of the participles. What makes the participles so exegetically significant, there's a great interpretive value, is one, not only is it frequently used, especially like authors like Paul in his letters, but two, the participle will be translated in a number of ways. So far, you've only learned a couple of ways to translate the participle. Mostly, it's been a temporal participle that you've translated. So you've been translating adverbially the participle as while if it's present tense, and after if it's an aorist tense or a perfect tense participle. So you've done translations while after. But sometimes, depending on the context, a temporal translation is not the best way to translate the participle. Sometimes you can translate it as an instrumental participle. And instead of using these conjunctions while or after, you might use the conjunction by. So he'd emptied himself by receiving the form of a servant. So lambone here is being translated as by receiving. And you might sometimes translate things as a concessive participle. So instead of while or after, you use the conjunction though. So though being sinners, or though we were sinners, Christ died for us. And here, anton is the present participle for me. Sometimes it can be translated as a regular verb. Usually they're paired. So especially when things seem redundant. So one of the most frequently used examples is and Jesus answering said. Okay, so here answering apokrithes is your deponent word, and it's a participle. Here's the finite verb, and you could say Jesus after answering said, but a lot of times, because answering and said almost happen at the same time, a lot of your translations translate this as what we call the participle of attendant circumstance, and therefore they translate it as two finite verbs: Jesus answered and said. The most famous example is Matthew 28:19, the Great Commission. The only finite verb is make disciples. The going, the baptizing, the teaching them, everything I've commanded you, the going, the baptizing, and the teaching are all participles. But a lot of times what you see in translations are not participles, but go, therefore make disciples. What's happening here is that the going and the teaching and the baptizing are all qualifications of making disciples. What does it mean to make a disciple? 1, you have to go. 2, you have to teach. 3, you have to baptize. And so this is all part of the command making disciples. And again, this is an example of the participle attendant circumstance. Mounts also gives other examples. Causal participle, where the participle is translated with the conjunction because. A telic participle, where the purpose is the participle is translated as in order to or for the purpose of. A conditional participle, where the conjunction being used to translate the participle is if. I'll let you look at these examples on your own. All of these are extra information, a way for you to know that the participle is much more than translating it as after or while, or as a relative clause, who or which, for it. And with that, we are done with our module.